Without further ado, it is actually my great pleasure to start off today's discussions with introducing you our keynote speaker, Professor Rose Luckin. Professor Luckin is a professor of learner-centered design at the University College London Knowledge Lab. Her research involves the design and evaluation of educational technology using theories from learning sciences and techniques from artificial intelligence. Professor Luckin is also a director of Educate, a London hub for educational technology startups. Researchers and educators who work together on the development of evidence-informed educational technology. In 2017, Professor Luckin was named on the Selden list as one of the 20 most influential people in education. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Luckin, who will give a talk entitled Lessons from COVID, How to Support Educational Ecosystems Through Technology. Professor Luckin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the lovely introduction. I think it is really important that we learn lessons from what happened during the pandemic, and I recognise, the scene that you set, because we do see schools kind of wanting to go back into the comfort blanket of the way things were previously, and yet it was technology that really helped them to save the day when things got really tough. We went from the standard classroom that so many teachers understand, love, know how to orchestrate learning within. And then we had a pandemic. In fact, we still have a pandemic. And things changed dramatically for quite a long time. And indeed, in some parts of the world, students are still not back in school. And in some parts, they're only just going back to school. And I think these pictures really capture a lot of what happened, from the emotional situation to the physical changes to the need to be creative and inventive, and people getting together. Because I think a lot of what was missed was that social interaction. That's the part that was very hard to recreate on systems like Zoom. But it was certainly technologies that came in and really helped educators to make sure that teaching and learning continued to happen for the most part. And we wanted to look at the ecosystem around educational technology, to think about how the different stakeholders who were part of the education technology landscape experienced the changes that happened during the pandemic. And so we conducted quite a long study looking at the different stakeholders. So looking at parents, looking at educators, looking at educational technology company, looking at leaders, and looking at some policymakers as well, and trying to capture different sources of data that we could analyze to try and get a more complete picture about what happened and what we can learn from what happened to point us in useful directions for the future. And so we did qualitative data collection, interviews, we did quantitative data collection, and we also did some collection of data from platforms like Twitter and school websites, and pulled it all together. And I just want to reflect on what we've learned from that. Now, this is very UK-centric, this data, but I have spoken to people in many parts of the world, and it seems to resonate, at least to an extent. There are different stresses and strains in different parts of the world, but this seems to resonate quite well. So it would be interesting to see how it resonates with some of you. And so from the qualitative analysis, these are some of the quotes from what people said that I think do sum up their feelings. In a positive sense, there was a lot of learning, a lot of professional development, particularly when teachers work together. And they really began to look at education in a different way and think about whether it could be done differently. It freed them up in some instances. It was an opportunity for teachers and staff to use technology in a more meaningful way. And I love that last one. There's certainly a mindset that technology has a role to play in education. And that's what seems to be waning at the moment. But certainly that was the positive. Now, of course, it wasn't all positive, but that's a set of positive views from across that stakeholder group about their experience of the pandemic. But if we look at some of the key findings from this piece of research, and obviously this is only a short talk, there's not time to go into too much detail, but I think it became clear that we really do need to pay more attention to the whole ecosystem within which the educational technology ecosystem or community is just a part, and we need to see its connections to the other stakeholders and the other communities. And what we saw was ineffective connections and communications between groups, particularly between government and school leaders, really compromised the integrity of the whole system and disabled it from being as self-supporting as it could have been had those communications been better. And not all of the members of the education community experienced the changes due to the pandemic and the disruption in the same way, of course. So we saw very different experiences, and those different experiences and concerns really need different support systems. And so it's not one size fits all. And through doing some analysis of the data that was about particularly educators' experiences, but as connected to the experiences of parents and school leaders as well, we came up with these 5 personas that described from the data the different types of profile we saw within educators and school leaders. So we had our aeronauts, who were mainly secondary school teachers in independent schools that really were able to relish the challenge and get on. They felt supported and they felt optimistic. Then we had the earth movers, who really were focused on pedagogical grounding and were able to be focused on pedagogical grounding. And again, this was mainly independent schools, but more primary, as opposed to the aeronauts, who were more secondary school. Now, mainly in the non-independent sector, so the state sector, and particularly in secondary school, we called it fire tamers, but there was quite a lot of firefighting going on. This was the largest group because they had to put their energy into tackling immediate challenges. But had they got the right tools, support, resources, they really could have shone brightly. They could do more. The water pilots were a very calm group, quite a small group, mainly from the independent sector, equally secondary and primary. And they really were calmly able to move around the obstacles. And when they were ready, they're happy to get tech savvy, but it's not something of a priority for them. And then finally, the space seekers, who really were focused on individual children, not surprisingly more in the primary school sector. They're able to do the basics and use technology to deliver learning for students, but they're very concerned to make sure that the learning space is appropriate for each child. And so we felt those personas were useful for thinking about how one might differentiate the sort of support that you offered educators in the pandemic, post-pandemic, if we are post-pandemic indeed. But looking at the connections, because this is where I think we have to focus our attention, between the different parts of that education ecosystem with specific respect to technology, it was really clear that when connections were strong, things were more positive. So parents who felt that communication with them from school leaders was clear were 10 times more likely to feel confident about the way the school was handling disruption. And communication between the edtech companies and the schools increased enormously. And what was really interesting about that is the tech companies responded by changing their products or services, if they could, to fit with the needs of the schools in this particular circumstance. And interestingly, the educators were far more engaged in technologies. I thought this was amazing. 74% of educational leaders and 81% of teachers, reported using and recommending technologies they'd never used before. Gosh, when would we have ever seen data like that previously? And I think that business of feeling supported is supremely important. It was great when you saw teachers feeling that they could get together and learn from each other. People did feel supported by colleagues, interestingly, not by government. And I thought it was really interesting that actually a lot of people felt supported by friends and family. So that support was really important, because there's a correlation we saw in the data between enjoying remote education and being confident about being able to sustain it, and between people feeling positive and feeling supported. So feeling supported makes you more able to feel positive about the future and more confident that you're going to be able to deliver good quality education using the tools available to you. And overall, there was definitely positivity about the opportunities, but how do we take advantage of that positivity? How do we build on that and not let it dwindle away? Well, I think we do have to recognise the barriers, and here are just three, and we all know that there are lots. There is, of course, a huge disparity in the technical infrastructure. This data is obviously for the UK, but I know there's disparity all over the place. We also saw a loss of trust in the big technology companies from the education community, not the smaller ones, but the big ones, because there was a lack of recognition that for schools, safeguarding was a supremely important and challenging issue that they had to have top of their agenda. And there was definitely a decrease in trust and effective communication between government policymakers and school leaders. And that they felt they were forced to make decisions with incomplete information. So what can we do about this? What can we learn from this? And I think for me, it's about adopting much more of an ecosystem mindset, rather than looking at schools or colleges or parents or students or the edtech industry or employers, to think of it as in a much more ecosystem way, to focus on building the symbiotic and productive relationships within communities, sub-communities, and between them. Now, this, I am particularly focusing on technology here, and that's a small part of the overall education ecosystem, but it's all connected, and we need to recognise those connections and look for ways to connect communities, particularly for that support, because that builds resilience into the system. So obviously, it's probably too ambitious to rethink the entire education and training ecosystem, but hey, we could. But I think it's important to start in small ways and to think about whether any proposed initiative can be shaped around the relationships that need to be built in order for that initiative to be supported and optimized. So we need those relationships to be supported and optimized. And of course, technology and data can really be leveraged to enable an initiative, to enable those connections, but also to deliver evidence about the benefits, or indeed the challenges, of those relationships and of the initiative itself. So what might the possible ingredients? So I want to sort of paint a picture of how it might be, but obviously one needs to think about what the ingredients are in any kind of potential scenario for the future. What would you need to have in place for this to be the case? So I think we do need to think about data, and think about data not just in the sense of being the foundations of evidence about efficacy, for example, or evidence of deprivation, evidence of standards, to think about it in a more AI type of way, to think about data models and how we can use data and AI to build an evidence bank for students, for educators, across that ecosystem in a different sort of a way. If we can think about the sorts of partnerships between different communities and sub-communities, plus the technology infrastructure, and think about how not only there's a relationship between the different people in those communities and sub-communities, but also a relationship between the different people and the technologies. And when it comes to AI, a relationship whereby we need to work out where the control is, where the decision making is, to what extent it's with the AI, data driven, and to what extent it's with the educator, the parent, the student. So we need to think about that interface, that relationship between the people and the AI. And again, another possible ingredient for the scenario that I'm going to run through is an acceptance that assessment can be driven by the learner and it can be supported by the stakeholders, and that it can underpin a whole range of different qualifications by this individual student evidence bank. So this is just one possible future and some of the ingredients. At the end, I'll run through some more generic suggestions. So if we were to look at an initiative thinking from an ecosystem mindset, what might it look for? And I say within 5 years, technically do it next year, but politically, socially, no. But the point is, this is not using any technology that's rocket science. It's actually technically quite simple, but scaled. So if we take Chris, who's a 15-year-old student, he's very keen on computer gaming, he's looking forward to his next round of assessment. Wow, that's unusual. A partnership between his school and the local technical college in Southampton, now that's in the south of the UK, and a game design studio in Edinburgh, that's in the north of UK, mean that Chris can evidence the way that his learning within school subjects such as maths, physics, art, plus the extra graphics module that he's taken at the college in Southampton, so not his school, have been applied to the design of the studio project he's working on with the team in Edinburgh. Where possible, Chris's learning has been enabled by technology. From the way that he has been able to work remotely with the team in Edinburgh to the simulation system that he uses for his studies at the college, and his school's AI-enabled adaptive platform that provides one-to-one tutoring across the curriculum to complement the teacher-led sessions. There's lots of different relationships in there. Relationships between people, between Chris and the team in Edinburgh, between Chris and his school, between Chris and the college in Southampton. Relationships with technology that enable those communications and relationships, and underpinning technology that's driven through data collection, this enabled adaptive platform. And this brings me to a key point in all of this, and that is the crucial role that data and AI literacy has to play in the future. But that's not to say that human relationships aren't important, even more important. I think when we think about technology, it's very easy to imagine classrooms full of kit. I see it quite in the opposite way. I see more human interaction, but very targeted human interaction. So Chris has regular conversations with his teachers to discuss the way that the evidence through this AI-enabled platform about his achievements is stacking up. These conversations are particularly important because they focus on his ability to be good at learning, as well as his ability to evidence his progress. So that's the way that we're using AI to analyze the data across all of Chris's interactions, whether it's with the college, with the team in Edinburgh, or at his school. A core subject for all students at Chris's school is data and AI literacy, which has been vital to his ability to build his own evidence bank about his achievements. Some of the data in Chris's evidence bank has been collected automatically from technology that he uses. Other data has been added by his teachers, college tutors, the design team colleagues in Edinburgh, his parents, and Chris himself. A range of AI algorithms are applied to the data to extract key pieces of evidence that demonstrate the outcome of Chris's hard work. Chris and his teachers understand enough about the AI to be able to work with it, to guide the data processing, to extract the particular type of evidence that will be important for Chris as he moves into further study and employment. So that again highlights the relationship between the people and the AI and the data. So what could we conclude from the analysis that we did and the way that I'm presenting the need to move to this ecosystem mindset? I think we just need to try and, even if it's in small ways, see the way that we can build relationships, strengthen relationships. And technology can be really important in building those connections and the communications that can support each community, each sub-community across the communities. And especially AI can be developed across the different communities in the ecosystem so that we have something that fits more the needs of that ecosystem. And data and AI literacy are crucial for everyone. AI is not going away, and we really need to make sure that our education ecosystems are absolutely on top of it. So the kinds of questions that you might ask yourself if you're involved in policymaking, for example, is what are the communities within your education ecosystem or your educational technology community within that ecosystem? Can you map this out along with their current interrelationships, at least for part of the ecosystem? Where are the interrelationships strongest and most effective? And what can you learn from that? How can you build stronger partnerships between different communities and sub-communities to get that really important support? What's the technology infrastructure that will enable those effective relationships, and can you build it? And how can you, or indeed can you, support a change in mindset towards an acceptance that assessment can be done differently? Because assessment always drives what happens in education, and that the right technology infrastructure can underpin new, more powerful assessment mechanisms, as can that all-important data and AI literacy. But fundamentally, it's all about a change of mindset to move away from seeing individual elements of the ecosystem to looking to see the relationships between those different parts of the ecosystem. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that that resonated with some of you and that it was useful. And I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the discussions. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Luckin. It was very enriching talk and very enlightening with many important points for the future. I think this is especially fascinating considering that the UK, I think together with Australia, are really on the forefront in the so-called datafication of education.
Yes.
So it was very fascinating to hear about your experiences.
For good and for bad. I didn't say that we do have to be very careful about the ethics. It's super important, but I was trying to portray the positive side of things today.
Yeah, exactly, which actually leads to the question that I was aiming to raise, because I do know that there are many scholars who are, I would say, highly critical of the datafication of education and all these advancements we are seeing. Ben Williamson, Neil Selwyn, to just name a few. So how would you respond to these critics? How are you dealing with them?
I mean, I think it's good that we have critics because we do need to look at the risks. But for me, the potential benefits have to be recognized. And rather than preventing those benefits because we're highlighting the risks, it's about looking at how we reduce the risk in order to gain the benefit. Because from my perspective, if we were to say, right, okay, we're going to stop this datafication, we're not going to use the kinds of technologies that are data-driven or that can process that data to tell us more about what's happening, that would be depriving so many people of an education that we could provide through those systems that we can't provide without that technology and that data analysis that allows us to provide more focused interactions that are more effective. So I think it's valuable to have critics because there are issues, huge problems or challenges, let's not call them problems, challenges with respect to ethics. But that's really why I put so much stress on data and AI literacy, because part of the problem is that the vast majority of the population don't understand anything about data and AI. And that puts them at so much greater risk than they would be if they did understand more about it. And I think, yes, we have to have strong regulation. That's super important. But actually, equally important is strong education. so that people understand what the risks are, so that if they agree to something, they're agreeing to it knowing the risks. So yes, I think it's valuable to have critics. I've got huge respect for both of the people you named and others, and it's really important that they're there. But it's also really important that we don't let those risks stop us trying to achieve the benefits in an ethical way. It's just fundamental that we must do it in an ethical way. And the other point I think it's important for people like Ben and Neil to recognize, and I'm sure they do, is that it's happening anyway. You know, the big tech companies are doing it anyway. And so unless we really engage with it and try and make it happen in a beneficial way, we're actually depriving people of a better version of what they're probably going to end up with, if you see what I mean, if we don't do anything. So not doing anything is not an option. We want to get the benefits, so we have to address the challenges in order to achieve the benefits.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I totally agree that we need to take this agentic role to our own hands and really try to approach it in an ethical manner, obviously. Thank you so much. It was very enriching.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.